myself and some other colleagues put together a couple years ago that was really trying to bring together people who had a background in the sciences with people who were working in the humanities, whether English, literature, or like myself, in history. And today's session, I think, brings lots of these different disciplinary areas together with our guest, Eric Sanderson. So just a few words about Eric's background. Eric Sanderson is a senior conservation ecologist at the Wildlife Conservation Society, which is still fondly known to some of us as the Bronx Zoo. Sanderson received his PhD in ecology from the University of California at Davis in 1998. And starting that same year at the Society, he established the Landscape Ecology and Geographic Analysis program to introduce landscape thinking and geographic analysis to his institution's work on conservation of rare and endangered species. In 2002, Dr. Sanderson and his colleagues created something called the Human Footprint Map, which was the first look at humans' global impacts that you could go down right to 1 kilometer per square kilometer resolution. He's also an expert on species conservation and has contributed to efforts to save lions and tigers and bears, as well as jaguars, tapirs, peccaries, American crocodiles, and now, in a way, I suppose, Homo sapiens as well.
Right. That's the hardest one.
This work has taken him from Argentina to Tanzania, Mongolia, Yellowstone Park, and the Adirondack Park. He's also the director of the Mannahatta Project, an effort to reconstruct the historic ecology of Manhattan Island at the time of European discovery in the early 17th century. This project has resulted in a hefty book published in 2009, as well as an innovative, and I must say much skinnier website, an exhibition, and has attracted extensive media attention. For many New Yorkers, it's given them a new perspective on their surroundings, helping them to reimagine, or perhaps unimagine, the city's intensive built environment. We're so very pleased to welcome him today to Stony Brook. And that could go right in your pocket.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you all for coming. All right, I'm going to talk to you today about cities, particularly New York City, and how it's changed over time and how it's changing into the future. And in particular, I'm going to try and focus a little bit on the aspects of bringing research in the humanities together with research in the sciences. I'm an ecological scientist, and I work for a conservation organization. Conservation is all about people and how do you talk to people about why nature is important. And that's true on the other side of the world and in countries all over the world, and it's true right where we live. And to try and get that idea across, a number of years ago, I started a project to try and understand what this island was like. This is Manhattan Island, as it might have looked to Henry Hudson on the afternoon of September 12, 1609, some 400 years ago. So this is Mannahatta. Mannahatta means the island of many hills to the Lenape people. That's the Native Americans that lived on Manhattan when Hudson arrived. You can see some smoke rising from their village site or settlement site near the Cluck Pond in lower Manhattan. And through a research program that took about 10 years, we discovered that this island had 55 different ecological communities, different kinds of ecosystems, over 1,000 different species, that people have been living here for thousands of years. The Lenape probably for hundreds of years, but other human cultural groups for thousands of years. And that the particular qualities of this place helped it become the city that we know it today. And part of the process of this work is to help us think about the decisions we're making, the way that Hudson and the people that lived at his time made some decisions that led to where we are. I'm interested in how do we shape the decisions we're making today that will affect people who live in the same place 400 years from now. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the research project, how we've come to understand Mannahatta, and then I'm going to show you two applications that build on that research and that way of thinking going forward. Because of course, the place has changed some, right? And I think we need to see it in a historical progression, a historical frame, where history doesn't end today. It actually, in some sense, begins today. And this work isn't about doing away with the city at all. It's just about trying to take some of the elements of sustainability and resilience and strength and abundance and diversity that were true for the forest and actually build them into the city. I came to New York as somebody who loved the forest, who loved nature, and that's why I work for a conservation organization. And what I found is that I love the city just as much, and for many of the same reasons. When I walk in the forest, I see all of these amazing animals and plants, these critters that are doing things that I don't really have a full understanding of what they're doing, and yet somehow they're finding a way to live with each other. And that's exactly the way I feel when I'm walking down the street in New York City. It's how can all these crazy cast of characters be living here and finding a way to make it work? Both the city and nature are built on strength of diversity, and so part of the work is about appreciating that and celebrating that and actually finding ways to promote that kind of diversity going forward. But whereas the forest on the left had a way of surviving for thousands of years before Henry Hudson arrived, not fixed and unchanging, changing all the time, but changing in a way that allowed all those 1,000 plants and animals to live there, including people, I'm not sure the place on the right will last for 1,000 years in its current form. And if we really love the city, if we really love our country, if we really love the places we live, how do we imagine a future that actually makes it possible to live in a place for a long period of time? So that's this Welikia Project, we call it. Welikia builds on Mannahatta and expands the work over the rest of the city. And so we've kind of completed the Manhattan work, and now we're working on the Bronx and Brooklyn and Queens and Staten Island and the waters in between. So I'll talk to you some about that. And people are an important part of the story. So people are not outside of nature. It's not nature versus people. It's people as part of nature. And some of the people we talked about are the Lenape people who lived here, lived on Manhattan 400 years ago. And Algonquin-speaking people. New York City, the sort of southeast New York, was the northern end of the range, and they lived across New Jersey and into eastern Pennsylvania. And of course, they had a particular way of living, a particular lifestyle that's very different from the European way of living that followed them. And they help us say this word Welikia, which is one of their words. So can you say Welikia with me?
Welikia.
Welikia. Welikia means my good home. And it's what you'd say about your wigwam when someone came to visit you. And we had to come up with this term because they didn't have a name for New York City at all, right? They had a name for Manhattan because Manhattan was an island. So from Mannahatta, we get Manhattan. But they didn't have an idea of the Bronx or Brooklyn or Queens. Those are all European names. So we wanted a name to embrace the whole project. So Welikia Bronx, and Welikia Queens, and Welikia Brooklyn, and Staten Island. So to do this work, we go back in time to look at resources that tell us what the landscape was like before heavy urbanization. This is a map of Manhattan on the west side, about 125th Street. I don't know if you know, underneath the West Side Highway, if you like. There's a market there just north of Columbia University, the Fairway Market, that a lot of people in Manhattan know. This painting's from the 1840s. It's by Victor Gifford Audubon, John James Audubon's son. John James Audubon, of course, the famous wildlife painter who lived on Manhattan at the time. That's John James sitting on the rock, watching the men bring in the striped bass and American shad out of the Hudson River. And we're looking north. That's the forested part of Washington Heights, and that point of land is where the George Washington Bridge goes across to New Jersey today, right? Just to help you situate there. And I thought, how come we don't talk about the beaches of Manhattan, or the forests, or our relationship to the river? Because for hundreds of years, that was a primary way of thinking about Manhattan. For thousands of years, if we admit the Native Americans into our history. How can we rediscover what these places were, these old beaches? And the way we do that is through maps. And I'm going to go to my GIS, pop out of the PowerPoint here. And I want to talk to you a little bit about this particular map. This is the British headquarters map from 1782, 1783. And it shows, we're just looking at the southern tip of Manhattan here. But this map actually shows all of Manhattan, all the way up to Inwood and Spuyten Duyvil, the northern part of Manhattan. The original's 10 feet long and 3.5 feet wide, 6 inches to a mile scale. So a very, very detailed map. made over an 8-year period when the British were occupying New York City during the American Revolution. So remember there was the Battle of Brooklyn in 1776. At the same time that the Founding Fathers were signing the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia, there's actually a battle going on in New York. The British bring 21,000 troops across the ocean to attack Washington, who's deployed in New York City, which you see there, that's the pink blocks down there, and along Brooklyn, on the Moraine in Brooklyn Heights. The British got around its line, went over Jamaica Pass, almost destroyed Washington's army. Just at the last minute was Washington able to pull a lot of his army back and get them into Manhattan. There's a series of battles over the course of 1776, over the summer and the fall. And Washington, he loses. He doesn't keep Manhattan. He doesn't keep New York City. But he doesn't lose his army. He allows his army to fight on. And so the British then come and occupy New York. And why do they do that? Well, for one, it was the second largest city in the colonies at the time. There were about 40,000 people living in New York City at the time that this map was made by the end of the war. And it has an amazing, and has an amazing deep water port. That the water's actually quite deep off to the tip of Manhattan down here at the Southern Edge. So if we look at this map was made for military planning purposes. So in case Washington attacked, this is how they would know where to put their troops and place their cavalry and place their cannon and that sort of thing. So you can see how it has the blocks of the city down here, and we'll look at that in more detail, but also these fortifications, this wall along here, this wall up here on Jones Hill. This is a star fort here, another one here. Some walls here along the Hudson River in case there's a amphibious landing from New Jersey. Down here in lower Manhattan, the streets are pretty much the same as they are today, because these are the old Dutch streets. So here's a Bowling Green at the tip of Broadway, and this is the old fort, the old Dutch fort, which is now where the Customs House is, or the Museum of the Native American Indian from the Smithsonian in lower Manhattan. So that makes this street here, where it says Town of New York, that's Broadway coming north. And that means this is Wall Street. Here's Trinity Church, which was standing then, and here's Wall Street. And you can see how the hills are sort of subtly shaded underneath the blocks. Do you see that? This is before they'd invented contour lines, so they're actually showing the hills using patchers. If we go north, here's City Hall Park. This is St. Paul's Church right here. And you can see the city kind of ends, right? The city sort of ends. And then you start to see all kinds of curious things, like this. This is the Collect Pond. This is the fresh water source for the city for its first 200 years. This is the Couch Hook. In Dutch, they called it the Couch Hook because it was covered with shells. That's what couch means, shell in Dutch. So it was the Shell Mound Hill. These are marshes, the Lispenard marshes. These were, you can see they've been channelized already, even in the 18th century. But this canal, eventually they made it larger when they were draining the Collect Pond, and it became the Canal Street in Chinatown. Over here are beaches. See this sort of stippling on the side? This is the Greenwich Road, which is now Greenwich Street, which is not on the shore anymore, but it used to be right along the edge here because it went up to Greenwich. This is Richmond Hill and Monetta Water. This stream used to come down through Greenwich Village, right through Washington Square Park, and then out this way. These are the Sand Hills. How many people have been to Union Square? Yeah. Did you see a hill there? Yeah. These hills don't exist anymore. They were leveled. Same with this hill. Over here, there was a little swamp in this little valley right here, and the Dutch called it Crom Regashi, and the British had a hard time saying that, so they call it Gramercy, like Gramercy Park. It was the little crooked swamp. This is the Sunfish Pond and Murray Hill. The Murray Hill is a hill. That's actually the Murray's house on Murray Hill. This is how many people have been in Times Square? Yeah. This is Times Square circa 1782. Just a dusty country road, crossing some streams. These are remnant beaver ponds, and this is a wetland. This stream is called the Great Kill, and there's actually colonial British writings about brook trout fishing in this stream. This is one of the first places that people fly fished in America, was in this stream. So you can see all the hills, Mannahatta Island of many hills, all the hills. This hill is called the Dove, it's shaped like a dove. This stream went down right through the middle of where 6th Avenue is today. And it turns out it flowed north, just like the traffic on 6th Avenue. So sometimes when I'm giving tours in the city, I say, just imagine the taxi cars, little packets of water going down the stream. This is into our Central Park now. This is the stream they dammed to make Belvedere Lake. So that makes this the Ramble, this hill here. And Belvedere Castle, when you get the weather from Central Park, they measure it here on the top of this hill. This hill doesn't exist anymore because it was the original receiving reservoir for the Croton water system stopped right here. It was Lake Mannahatta. And then eventually they filled it in, and now it's called the Great Lawn, and people play softball and soccer there. It's very flat. There's no rocks. That's because they blew them all up when they built the reservoir. This is Otterspore, called because river otters used to live there. This is a stream that went all the way to, actually a tidal inlet, all the way to 5th Avenue, creating this pass, the Gallons Pass. This is a great hill in Central Park. This is the Plains of Harlem. And that's that beach we saw before. Anyway, I think this is just an extraordinary map. And it turns out, for 3 reasons, that it's really accurate. It's actually very, very carefully mapped. And one reason is that in the late 18th century, they were actually figuring it, the British in particular, were figuring out how to do modern maps. They were making maps that are, like what you would see on Google Maps. And they had many of the same techniques. They didn't have GPS, but they had plane tables and theodolites and chains, so they could actually measure distances. They also, they really wanted a good map of Manhattan for defensive purposes, because this was the central headquarters of the British Army in New York, and it was very important to them. New York City is actually the last place the British left in 1783 on evacuation day. And the third thing they had was time. So because they took Manhattan in 1776, they held it all the way to the end of the war, 8 years. And so it was very important to them. So they made this map, of which this is just one of hundreds of maps made in the New York City region during the Revolution by the British military. There's also a smaller number of American military maps and French military maps. But the thing I found most compelling about this map as an ecologist is not the buildings and the fortifications, but the ponds and the streams and so forth. And the idea was if I could georeference this map, if I could put it into the modern geography of the city, then we could figure out where these features used to be with respect to the city as we know it today. So to do that, you find points on the map that you know their modern location, and you rectify it. You tell the computer how to change it, to transform it into the modern coordinate system. And if I do that, I'm going to put the streets of the city on the top here. And you can see down here in Lower Manhattan, they match very closely. In fact, we were able to get the British headquarters map within about 40 meters of its location. There's a little bit of air in Northern Manhattan, down here in Lower Manhattan. It's quite close, actually. And you put the buildings of the city there. And so you see the collect pond here. Right? So you can actually see how the collect pond overlays the buildings. And then we can digitize the collect pond. We'll pull it above the streets. And we can digitize from this map the maps the streams that you see this building here. This hexagon is the New York City Courthouse. That's the building you see at the beginning of Law and Order. They're walking up the steps, right? So what this means is they could have walked down those steps right into the collect pond. Yeah? So when Nick Baumgartner wrote about the project in the New Yorker a number of years ago, he said this is sort of a naturalist version of George Washington slept here. Like, oh, look, there's a pond, and look, there's a stream, and oh, that's why my basement always floods when it rains. It helps people connect with the nature of their place, right? And of course, one of the amazing things about New York City is people think it's so transformed that it doesn't have nature. But in fact, it still has water and climate, and there's still animals living there, there's still people living there. We take people as part of nature, they're still there. What's changed is the ecosystems, and so this is a way of trying to connect people to that. And by georeferencing it this way, we can start to learn things, we learn about how the landscape has changed over time. So let me take away the buildings here and the streets for a minute. then we go down here to lower Manhattan. And using older maps, older than the British headquarters map, we were able to reconstruct the shoreline. So that's the 1609 shoreline. And here's the modern shoreline of Manhattan. So this blue line is where we think the shoreline was in 1609. This line is where it was in 1782. And this black line is where it is today. So, and there's actually some secondary evidence that supports this. This street here is called Pearl Street. Pearl Street it's called Pearl Street because it had shells there from the Native Americans who, were eating oysters and clams out of the harbor and would leave the shells there. And that's when the Dutch came, they called it Pearl Street. Then during the Dutch and the British times, they actually valued so much building out the city that they would sell these water lots. You could buy the water between the high tide and the low tide and then fill it in. And then you could build a wharf on it, right? And particularly on the east side here, that was very lucrative. So the next street out is called Water Street, right? Pearl Street, Water Street. Next one out is Front Street, right? Because that's on the front. And then we get Robert Moses and the FDR Highway. And this is Battery Park City, right? This is what they did with the fill when they were digging the hole to make the World Trade Center, which turns out it's right over here, right on top of this beach. Right here. Guess where the water went during Hurricane Sandy? Did it stop here? Did it stop here? No, it went here. And there are buildings here now. There are buildings here. The New York Seaport Museum is right in here, and they had really terrible flooding, right, along the South Street Seaport. So that's one way that the past actually presages something about the future, about our time. So let me go back to the PowerPoint for just a second here. Show you this slide. So how do we use this in an ecological way? Well, in ecology, we talk about the ecological play. And the ecological play is played on a stage. And that stage is based on a set of physical factors that describe habitats and places where plants and animals live. Geology, topography, water, shoreline, land cover. And a lot of what we needed to know about the physical geography of Manhattan came from the British headquarters map. It's indicated with these pink colors. And once you have some idea of this, you can use models with the GIS to predict things like watersheds and slope and flooding depth and salinity gradients and soils and all kinds of other aspects of the physical environment. And that, if you like, sets the stage for what's going to happen ecologically. But then there's the drama. There's the disturbance that comes in. And disturbances are processes that disrupt systems. So things like fires and land use and hunting and wind throws and flooding. And I probably should add hurricanes, right? So hurricanes, and these are processes that happen periodically, and they destroy things. They disrupt the structure. They remove biomass. And these disturbances interact with the physical factors to set the stage for the ecosystems to play out. And those ecosystems, they play out in a spatial way, a specific way in space, so that we can describe a mid-reach stream. A mid-reach stream is a kind of stream ecosystem, and it has a definition that you find these well-defined pattern of alternating pools, ripples, and runs, where waterfalls and springs can be present. So we can make a relationship between where you would expect a mid-reach stream to be and a combination of physical factors and disturbance factors that create that system. Or salt marshes, or chestnut oak forests. And using these techniques, we were able to reconstruct the 55 different ecosystem types that were on Manhattan. In fact, this is how we figured out that it was 55. There's a New York State Ecological Community Guide, and we were just working down the list, and we kept checking them off, and it seemed like a lot. In fact, if you look at the vegetation map for Yellowstone, it has 63 types. And Yellowstone National Park is 2.2 million acres. It's much, much larger than Manhattan. And Manhattan has 55 types, right? 55 different ecosystems. So this, you don't even have to be an ecologist to understand that, like, if you have a diversity of ecosystems, you have a diversity of habitat types. And if you have a diversity of habitat types, you're going to have many, many different kinds of plants and animals in there. So to go back to the GIS then, I'll show you what that actually means. So we zoom out a little bit, take away the modern shoreline here. So imagine taking this map and stripping away the streets and the roads and the fortifications, and then starting to derive layers from it, like the streams and the beaches and shoreline. And then we can add other information to the map. We can add the bedrock geology, right? And the surficial geology. This is what the glaciers left on top of the bedrock geology. And that, plus the topography, allows us to say something about the soil types. And we can use soil types that have been described for the New York City region that have, official definitions and designations from the Natural Resource Conservation Service to describe the 18 soils that were on Manhattan. We can derive the topography. So Mannahatta is the island of many hills. Well, where are the hills and how high were they? And if you have this, then you can ask the GIS to tell you where the slopes are, how steep they are, which way they're facing. You can run a wind across the map. Winter wind, to figure out where the places that are protected in the wintertime from the wind. And then all this information then becomes food for models about where the Native Americans might have lived. And so this red map is based on taking the archaeology that we know for the city and some historical sources, placing locations on the map, and then deriving a model, interpolating a model of where they live. Because we know that the archaeology is a sparse record. It doesn't have all the places that were possible, right? Many of the places, like down by the Collect Pond, the archaeology was messed up 400 years ago or 200 years ago. We can't get that back anymore, but we can use models in space to try and reconstruct how the landscape was seen by the Lenape. In this case, they like to live in places near fresh water and relatively flat with good soils and access to the coast because they like to fish and collect shellfish resources. So that's what this map is a place where those things are most abundant. So in this way, we can start to, the historical record always has holes in it, right? It always has these spaces. And so in other kinds of science, what we use is, models to try and interpolate between those spaces and try and say something about the place that we don't know anything about based on things that we do know about. So this is just one example. And we did this over and over again eventually for all the species. And developed a whole stack of layers describing the landscape here. This is the map of the ecological communities, like 55 different ecosystems. So each color here is a different kind of ecosystem. And again, that ecosystem, as we think it might have been on the afternoon of September 12th, 1609, when Sanderson arrived. Go back to this. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. Talk about this. So when we think about Native Americans, we think about people in the landscape. They lived at really different densities than we do. Native Americans, they live about these hunting and gathering cultures lived about one person per square mile. Not much more about that. Manhattan has 65,000 people per square mile nowadays. 65,000 people per square mile. There's certain blocks that have over 100,000 people per square mile in terms of density. And so, density is really important for interactions of all kinds and all sorts. It meant for the Lenape that they could live here for a long time without overwhelming the landscape. And without needing very much. They got most of their food locally, most of their water, came from the streams of Manhattan. They got most of what they needed right around them. But they did have some impact, if you like. They, clear these campsites and make fields. They grew some crops. We think about 30% of their food came from the Three Sisters, corn, beans, and squash. They clear a field, and then after about 25 years, they would abandon the field and make what's an old field, which in their case was, we don't want that place anymore because the soils are depleted. But for the plants that came there, which were mostly grasses, it was actually grassland. So they created a little pocket of grassland in the forest, which is actually a very valuable kind of community. Eventually those old fields, after about 100 years, so this historical process of succession, would become shrublands and eventually different kinds of forests. And lots of different kinds of forests. And so these are the communities that they saw. We might see Inwood or Tribeca or the Upper East Side. They saw these ecological communities. They were their neighborhoods. And they were as characteristic to them as our neighborhoods are to us. I want to say, too, that probably because of people that the biodiversity of Manhattan was higher than it would have been otherwise, right? Because they were actually creating ecosystems that were not otherwise there. They were a disturbance agent. They were part of that drama of the ecological play, but one that actually allowed more players onto the stage. In our time, I think we often make the other decision, right? We make decisions, or we, live on the land in a way that homogenizes it and makes it possible for fewer species to live there. But we can also make some choices that, in the Lenape kind of way, could be working in an integral way with the landscape to actually make it richer and stronger and more abundant, more resilient over time. But that requires this sort of, combination of thinking, part of which is what lives in the humanities and comes out of the strength of the humanities to understand a place and understand our relationships to each other and to that place, as well as the scientific side to actually quantify and think about empirical relationships that establish between human activities and the other parts of the environment. Particularly as it comes to habitat. So, I think a really key way to think about the world is in terms of habitat, which is a core ecological concept. So habitat is where a species gets everything it needs, all of its requirements. And that's true for people, and that's true for every other plant or animal. In fact, this is a map of the game of life, which most of you are young people at the beginning of your adulthood. According to the game of life, you win if you get enough food, water, and shelter that you grow up to be about your age, to be an adult. And then if you reproduce, if you get your reproductive resources, then you really have won. As soon as you have kids, you've won in the game of life and allowed the next generation to go along. So in habitat is the combination of all the things you need to succeed. To have your home, right? Home is the place where you get everything you need. So we can use the definitions of home with all these maps in the GIS to try and predict the different distribution of species. If there's a stream here, then what kind of forest was along that block, and what kind of flowers and lichens and mosses and butterflies, and maybe fish in the stream, and birds in the trees. What kind of rattlesnake might have lived there, or a black bear, or maybe the Lenape used to hunt in this block. And we can generate an analysis of the biodiversity of a block on the Upper East Side, if you can imagine. Right? That the potential for nature isn't something that just lives in Africa or just lives in Yellowstone or lives far away. It actually is something that lives everywhere. Every square inch of the earth has the potential to support life on it. And it's the interactions between different kinds of life that actually spell out the play that's of that place. So we created a website where you can actually see this information. So you can log on to welikia.org/explore. You can zoom into Manhattan. You can pick any block in Manhattan, a block where you've been to school, or maybe you went to visit somebody, or maybe you've lived or worked there. And then you can get a list of all the plants and animals that might have lived in that block 400 years ago. So that's a picture of the kind of block, the kind of ecosystem that was in that block. And then these are long lists of mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish, and plants. There's tabs about the Lenape and the modern landscape. That are actually derived from geographic analysis that we did. And the reason I show this to you is I think it's kind of cool, but also because there's an emerging synthesis between geographic information and web technologies. That there's ways of talking about the work that we do, whether that's in the humanities or in the sciences, through the internet that makes it really accessible and really touches people. So this website get uses all the time in classrooms in New York City, because then a teacher in biology class can say, look, let's see what is in the block where this school is. Can you imagine that? How cool that is? I mean, that makes a direct connection between place and the environment that I think is really, really great. And it seems to be very, very well loved and appreciated. We also had a museum exhibit in 2009 at the Museum of the City of New York. Had 100,000 visitors, where you could actually see some of the original documents, and then there were these large kind of cameras that gave you a view onto the landscape of Manhattan from different perspectives. And the whole point of this exhibit was to help people see what's the connection between Manhattan and Mannahatta. How are cities and nature related to each other, and in some ways complements to each other. We wrote an education curriculum, et cetera, et cetera. And then I worked with my friend Mark Boyer to try and reconstruct what these views look like. And we used the tools that Hollywood uses, in Avatar or Lord of the Rings, but not for some made-up place, but for Third Avenue. So, you take the topography and you lay onto that the ecosystems, and then you fill those ecosystems with little 3D models of all the plants and animals that used to be there. And this is actually a specific place with a specific set of GPS coordinates. It's Times Square looking west, looking over towards New Jersey, to give people an idea of what the landscape looked like just before Henry Hudson arrived. So we could do this, kind of anywhere. We can take a picture out of any window in Manhattan and reconstruct what it might have looked like. Murray Hill from the east side. This is kind of what the view near the United Nations might have looked like. Or flying like a bird on the fall migration down the Hudson River. There's that beach at 125th Street. So that's Mannahatta on the left and New Jersey on the right. Or even imagine Henry Hudson, what was going through his mind. Right? And as you probably all know, Hudson, his big ambition was to get to China, right? His whole life was oriented toward getting to China, and he thought there was some Northwest Passageway to get there. And he thought the Hudson River was it. He thought he'd hit the gold mine when he saw the Hudson River and how big it was, especially when he got up to the Tappan Zee and it widened out. He thought he'd really found this thing. And he wanted to do that because he wanted to be wealthy, right? What was so valuable then was to be able to trade with China and get all these exotic goods. And it was that he was so obsessed with that idea of his role in history and his desires for himself and for his country and for his family that he missed entirely the wealth that was right before him, the wealth of the environment. This environment that had all of its parts and all interacted with each other. That's something that is completely absent in our world. There's no place that's like that anymore. That is a wild place where all the critters are there and they're all doing their thing, and nature is actually strong and resilient because of it. We have lots of stuff from China, and we don't have this anymore, which is why conservation is so important, of course. This work also allows us to sort of see the process of the juxtaposition between two states for the same place. So if we go back to the collect pond, we can see the fields for the Native Americans, we can see the salt marshes and the 7 different kinds of forests and the beaches, and there's the Hudson River again. And we can see that in the context of the city today. And it gives us a moment to pause and to think about the changes that have happened. What's good, what's bad. In some ways, this place is the manifestation of the aspirations of the people that have been living here for 400 years, right? Not all of which were met, but many of them were. Aspirations built on aspirations, creating the city that we live in today. It wasn't made out of whole cloth. It was made through a long historical progression. And there are still shadows of the old landscape that lie underneath. And that landscape is something that we try and reveal through these projects. And so let me tell you a little bit about Jamaica Bay, and then I'll show you a little bit about this new website called Mannahatta 249 that we built, and then I'll stop and we can have some questions. So, as I said, Welikia is about reconstructing the rest of the historical ecology of the rest of the city, and we're not finished with it. We're in the middle of the work. But right after Sandy, I made this map that's comparing our version of the historic wetlands on the right with the flood zones, the evacuation zones on the left. Do you see a correspondence between the two? Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's about an 80% correspondence between them. So, Sandy, because of its particular qualities and because of sea level rise, actually reflooded many of the same places that were formerly wetlands, the tidal wetlands that protected the city. Here's a modern satellite view of Jamaica Bay. Jamaica Bay is down here between Brooklyn and Queens, near JFK Airport. That's the airport there. These are the marshes you see when you're taking off from the airport. This is a map, geological map from 1902, and the reason I show this is because it shows that pink line up there. Do you see that? That's the glacial moraine. That's where the last glacier ended. That's where it stopped moving south, and then eventually retreated back to the north. And so everything that you're seeing south of that Rockaway Beach, these wetlands, underneath flatlands, Flatbush, and Queens, Jamaica Queens. All of that is sediment that flowed out of those glaciers. It's really, really thick. It's sand and silt. It's really, really thick. And at that time, when the glaciers were there, the sea was 100 miles offshore. 100 miles offshore. And this was just a little valley. And then slowly, slowly, the sea has returned and filled into this sort of thing. And this barrier beach system has come back with it. A barrier beach system that until really very recently was trying to move. This is a coastal survey map from 1844. And this is the Rockaway Inlet. That's Far Rockaway on the right. And Pelican Beach. I gave this talk at Kingsborough Community College originally. And that red star is Kingsborough Community College. It's actually at the end of Coney Island nowadays. So that's 1844. Here's the end of the Rockaway Peninsula in 1861. Here it is in 1882. Here is it in 1924. And that's where it is today. 9 miles. 9 miles is that barrier beach moved. Right? It kept moving until we tried to fix it, until we tried to stop it, right? Moreover, it built, and then we started to build things on it, like Breezy Point and the Rockaway communities here. Communities that were, of course, very affected by Hurricane Sandy because they're on a barrier beach system that wants to move. What we integrate the research that comes from many sources when we try and understand how Jamaica Bay responds to hurricanes. In this case, these are names. And I just wanted to point this out because place names are really important to us. Because a place name is what links a feature on a map to its literary tradition. So that allows us to get into the historical sources. And it also tells us something about how people thought about it as they changed the names over time. So the ecosystems of this part of the world are sand, which you can see on the 1844 map, and dunes, and then behind those, salt marshes that are fed by streams, with what was eventually a forested landscape, the upland landscape. And this is, nature's solutions to hurricanes in this part of the world, is barrier beaches with dunes, with wetlands back behind. That's how nature protects us. And it's actually a system that nature built for this purpose. As the storms come in, they actually throw sand up, and then the winds between the times move the sand, and then the beach grass holds the dunes in place. And then these salt marshes are actually designed to be flooded. So the dune breaks the motion from the wave and the surf, and then the water that flows over flows into the salt marsh and then flows back out and doesn't harm anything. But these systems, they, for the most part, don't exist anymore. They've been affected in lots of different ways as we've urbanized the landscape. So, and that's my bridge to, a lot of my current work is about thinking about the future. And I wrote a book that came out last summer called Terra Nova that's about how do we create a world that isn't locked into the patterns of the past? How do we create a world that actually enforces new kinds of land use and ways of thinking about our relationship to nature? That builds on some of these ideas from Mannahatta, but actually kind of projects them forward into the future. And that's the last thing I want to talk about just briefly for a minute is this Mannahatta 2409 website, which is about where do we go from here? There's a long historical process that brought us here. Where do we go over the next 400 years? Recognizing that, of course, ecosystems have changed. So this requires us to think about buildings as ecosystems, and streets as ecosystems, and parks as ecosystems. But they're all ecosystems, where an ecosystem is the non-living environment and the living things. So a building like this building is an ecosystem in the sense that it's a non-living constructed environment that has people here, you and me. That makes it an ecosystem. So one of the things we know about urbanization is it changes the ecosystems of the place. Another thing we know is that it changes the lifestyles of the people that live in the city. And these are 3 graphs out of Plan NYC, the New York City Sustainability Plan, comparing the consumption per person of water, electricity, and waste for an average American and an average New Yorker. So the average American is on the left, and the average New Yorker is on the right. And on a per-person basis, the average New Yorker uses less water, uses less electricity, and generates less waste. And this is the basis of something that I call the green metropolis hypothesis, after David Owen's book, which is the idea that if you want to be an environmentalist, if you want to be a conservationist, the best thing to do is actually to move to a city, because then you'll draw less resources from the rest of nature. So lifestyles change, ecosystems change, and the climate is changing, not just in the city, but everywhere. There's Sandy again. And we have some idea about what's going to happen in New York City over the next 100 years or so, which is basically warmer and wetter with a higher sea level rise. Right? This is what's coming. So our idea is, well, let's imagine we could build a website where you could change these things, change the ecosystems, change the lifestyles, and change the climate, and then see how the environment would respond in terms of water, carbon, biodiversity, and population. So water, like stormwater flows and water consumption rates; carbon, like energy consumption, fossil fuel consumption, greenhouse gas emissions; biodiversity, habitats and species; and population, number of residents, number of workers, number of pets, population density, that sort of thing. So how can you see how the environment responds, and then envision those changes in a historical sequence to see what was there before from the Mannahatta data, see what's there today, and then your vision of the future. So it's a way of actually creating, developing, and sharing visions of a more sustainable and resilient future for the city. So there's this website it's live now. Any of you can log on after this. It allows you these two paths. You can create your own vision, or you can browse other people's visions. We have about 40 visions that people have put in over the last couple of weeks. So I encourage you to check those out, and I encourage you to make your own. The idea is you log on, you give your vision a name, you assign it a year, you talk about which ecosystems you want to start with. Do you want to start with the ecosystems of 400 years ago? Or do you want to start with the ecosystems of today? It brings you to a web map like this, where you can zoom in and pick a block, or a set of blocks, and then it fills those in with the ecosystems that you chose. These little blocks, these little colors, represent different ecosystem types. The purples and reds and pinks are different buildings, oranges and yellows are streets and sidewalks. You can see those in the context of the larger landscape of the city today, as well as in terms of the historical landscape, these pre-European ecosystems. And then there are these tools over here on the right that allow you to paint the city, to paint single-family homes or office buildings, stadiums, to paint the ecosystems of 400 years ago or today, to change the street network and the transportation, and to add modifiers, streetcar lines, green roofs, and cisterns, and compost bins, a lot of the things that are commonly discussed in terms of the sustainability agenda. And then see metrics of performance. So if you look at that top line, the blue one, that's the water. The green line is the way those 6 blocks of the city performed 400 years ago. That brown line is how that 6 blocks performs today, and that red line is your vision. And we're seeing the runoff characteristics, greenhouse gas emissions, species, and density, population density. So it gives you these multi-metrics, these eco-metrics, these ecological metrics to understand your vision in contrast to the city today, and in contrast to the natural environment suited to that place of 400 years ago. And then when you get a vision you like, you can share it with everybody else. You can actually make it public, and then everybody else can see it, and then they can compare your vision to their vision and vice versa. So just to show you a quick example, so imagine Tompkins Square Park. It was formerly a wetland bordering on a forest. Today it's a park with sidewalks and